Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a first impressions video of the Anbernic RG556. Now this just arrived in the mail yesterday, and what I want to do in this video is talk about all the things that I can kind of make a quick judgment about. That's going to be things like the screen and the overall size of it, but then also how the buttons feel and the ergonomics, you know, things like that. So that's what we're going to focus on in this video. Then after about a week or so of testing, we'll do a full review where I'll talk about whether or not I think it's actually going to be worth buying in the first place. And so far, I'm pretty impressed with the whole experience. Now, there are a couple red flags, which we'll talk about in this video, but I think that just in a general sense, Anbernic is definitely improving upon other devices with this one here. Either way, even though this is a first impressions video, I do expect we're going to get into the details as well. So grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, we'll start with the specs. Now this is going to be using a new CPU that we haven't seen in a handheld before. It's the Unisoc T820. And this is an 8-core CPU. 4 of those cores are A76 cores, and one of them is clocked a little bit higher, but these are going to be your performance cores. And it also has 4 A55 efficiency cores. It also comes with 8 GB of LPDDR4X RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage, plus a microSD card slot. Now one of the main draws of this device is the display. It's 5.4 inches and also has a 1080p resolution, but it's also OLED. And there are a lot of handheld fans who are kind of ride or die when it comes to OLED, so I think a lot of people are interested in that one factor. We also have a pretty big battery. It's 5500 milliamp hours. Now, I didn't do a ton of battery testing just because I haven't had this device too long, but I did find that when I was really pushing it, I got an average of about 4 hours of gameplay. And so you can expect that if you're not going to be playing like PS2 and GameCube the whole time, you should get a lot better battery life than that. And it also weighs 345 grams or about 12.5 ounces. Now, in terms of connectivity, we have 5 GHz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth 5.0. And it's also capable of 1080p video out via its USB-C cable. Now I wasn't able to test that in this video, but I'll put that in the full review. The device runs Android 13 and has a couple other extra features, including Hall sensor analog sticks and analog triggers. Now, as you've probably already figured out, there are 2 different colorway options. There's the transparent blue as well as a black color. And in terms of pricing, it's going to retail for $185, although for the first month or so, it's going to be $175. But bear in mind that does not include shipping, and so depending on where you live, it might be more. For example, on their AliExpress page, you can see here that they're charging $15 to ship it to me here in Hawaii. And I'll leave links to these in the video description below. Now, before we get into the unboxing, I had to show off the hard shell case that they're selling with this device. And I have no idea what compelled them to use this Gucci or Coach knockoff, but it is a pretty hilarious design. Now, the quality on this is not great. It's kind of on par with those really cheap hard shell cases you can get on Amazon. Either way, I think the design here is unintentionally hilarious. Can you imagine walking around with this thing and someone's like, wow, what do you have inside? And you open it up and you're like, a fake Game Boy. Anyway, let's go ahead and move into the unboxing. Now, the packaging here is exactly what you would expect from an Anbernic device, just that kind of typical white box. And inside, we also have just the usual suspects. So we have a quick start guide that'll walk you through some of the buttons. It also comes with a screen protector and then a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. Let's go ahead and move on to the device itself, and we're going to unbox this transparent blue one. And this one's unique for a couple reasons. The first impression that I had right off the bat was the fact that it is so translucent, like I can see directly through it. It almost feels like you're playing with a device that's made out of glass, although it obviously does feel like plastic. Speaking of which, the feel of the plastic here is also super slick, like there's no grit or any sort of texture to it. And that can be a good or a bad thing depending on your own preferences. For most other transparent handhelds like the Odin Pro right here, it's always a little bit opaque in the fact that it's not perfectly see-through. So I actually do like the kind of glassy look here, although the feel of that very slick plastic is something that kind of comes hand in hand with that. It's also a little bit smudgier than I was expecting. The fingerprints start to show up almost immediately. Now, that being said, the smudging on this one is nowhere near as bad as it is on the black model. This one I actually opened up last night so I could get it fully set up in order to make this video, and just in those 4 or 5 hours where I was casually using it, this thing became a fingerprint magnet. The texture on this one is also fairly sleek. It's a little bit more gritty than the transparent model, but not by much. And so if anything, I would say this is a step back compared to a lot of other Anbernic devices. I don't know if I've ever seen one so smudgy and fingerprinty. In fact, it reminds me more like those really cheap Powkiddy devices that used to come out a couple years ago. And so that's my first red flag, is that the plastic quality on these devices is a lot worse than I was hoping. Now, another thing that really concerned me about this device were the ergonomics. Sometimes Anbernic can nail it, and then other times they get it completely wrong. And I have to say, the comfort and ergonomics of the Anbernic RG556 is some of the best I've ever felt from this company, hands down. I feel like the size of this thing is excellent. It is somewhat big, but also very roomy. And it's also still very easy to access all of the controls, no problem. There's no button that's hard to reach. And I think these big, chunky grips are really comfortable. It's a little bit on the ugly side just in the fact that they're so protruding, but the fact that they extend below the device means that you have a perfect place to put your pinkies, and that is very rare with a lot of retro handhelds. And so overall, when it comes to the shape and size and general comfort of this handheld, it is actually exceedingly good. When I first saw the images, I wasn't convinced, but as soon as I picked it up, I was like, okay, I see where they're going with this. It is a very comfortable handheld. Moving on, let's talk about the controls. We're going to start with these analog sticks. Now, these are Nintendo Switch style Joy-Con sticks, and these are the same Hall sensor sticks that we've seen in other Anbernic devices going back to, I think, the RG353M. The caps themselves have a grippy edge to them, which I've always liked. But if you've ever used a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con, you know that these sticks are a little bit small and a kind of flicky feeling. And that's definitely still the case here with this device, but maybe exacerbated more just by the fact that the device itself is so large and these sticks are so small. Now, when it comes to functionality, I did a couple tests. So starting with the gamepad tester, I did find that I had a full range of motion, although these sticks do have a bias towards the cardinal directions. It's the same way with the other sticks they've used in their other devices, so no surprise here. And when it comes to actual gameplay, I think this really does excel with more modern control styles, so something like a first-person shooter game or something that relies on analog controls. These sticks themselves still feel very small on a big device like this. It's probably another one of my red flags, but I do think it's time for Anbernic to consider redesigning their analog sticks. Speaking of redesigned, let's talk about the D-pad, because this one I've never seen before. It actually has a slick texture and quality to it. In fact, it reminds me the most of a Steam Deck's D-pad. It's also a rubber membrane connection like on the Steam Deck and has a very similar feel. In terms of just overall response and travel, it's all very satisfying. Anbernic is very good in that regard, but of course it always comes down to real-world testing. We're going to start with the contra test. And in this test, what I do is I push down the D-pad and then I move it left and right. And ideally, I'm looking for my character to not move too much. Maybe a little bit if I push it far enough, but I also want him to remain stationary if I'm just going to wiggle it a little bit. And unfortunately here, I'm finding that the character is moving more than I would like. And the big fear with this is that it would cause an accidental diagonal. And it can be bad in certain games like Contra. When you're trying to go down just to duck and instead you go diagonally, that means you might get shot. However, when actually testing the inputs in the gamepad tester, I found that it basically did a diagonal when I wanted to, but didn't when I didn't. And so even though, yes, it failed the Contra test, my inputs here are exactly what I was planning to do when I was pressing on that D-pad. And I had a similar experience when testing other games. For example, a platformer like Super Mario World, everything seemed to work correctly. And then also a precision platformer like Celeste. In this one, I am trying to go diagonally every once in a while, then trying to go straight and then up. And every time I wanted my character to go in a certain direction, it did. So I'm a little bit torn about this D-pad. Yes, it did fail the Contra test for me, but in all other practical regards, it seemed to be fine. And of note, it also passed the Street Fighter test, so I was able to do all sorts of Hadoukens and Shoryukens, no problem. It did take me a bit to acclimate to the overall feel of this D-pad just because it's so slick, but after a few minutes of acclimation, I was good to go. Okay, also on the left side, we have our Anbernic button. This will bring up their own front-end launcher. And then to the right of that, we have the home/back button. If you just tap on it, it'll be the back button. If you hold on to it for a couple seconds, it'll be the home function. Next, let's take a look at the right side, starting with the face buttons. Now, these buttons are slick just like the D-pad. In fact, I think they might be the same buttons that were in the RG35XX Plus and the 35XXH. Again, these have a rubber membrane connection and a very kind of classic feel to them, so no surprises here. Below those, we have another analog stick and then our select and start buttons. Now, these are on the bottom right, and I'm never a huge fan of that. I'd love to have them up at the top corners, kind of like a Switch Lite, but all the same, no big complaints for me either. Next, we'll take a look at the I/O. We'll start with the top. So on the left side, we have our power button and volume up and down. And then to the right, we have an exhaust vent for our active cooling fan. Now, when it comes to the shoulders and triggers, these are actually pretty decent. The shoulders are a little bit small in the fact that you kind of have to feel your way around them, and they're clicky but quiet and also easy to press down on, so no complaints when it comes to the shoulder buttons. Now, these triggers are the first analog triggers we've seen from Anbernic across the board. And so props to them for finally getting into this design. So I think there's two things to note about these analog sticks. Number one, they are Hall sensors and they feel very smooth and accurate. In fact, when going back to that gamepad tester app, when I press on these triggers, it feels exactly where I expect them to be. So when I press them 50% of the way, they show up as being 50% in the register, and same thing when I go to 100%. So I think overall this is a very accurate trigger. So I think this is going to work out pretty well for certain emulated systems like Nintendo GameCube, and then I also think it's going to be great when you're streaming more modern games. Now, another thing to note, I think the resistance on these triggers is quite high. And by that, I mean that it takes quite a bit of force to fully press them down. Let's compare that to other similar handhelds. We'll start with the Odin Pro. And I think among all the handhelds that I own, the design of this one is actually the closest to the RG556. Here you can also see the travel is a lot shallower and much easier to press down on. I would say the resistance here is about half of what it is on the other. And it's a similar story with other handhelds, including the AYN Odin 2 and the Retroid Pocket 4 and 4 Pro. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say this is a problem, but it's definitely something that I observed, and so if you are going to be playing a lot of trigger-heavy games, this might be fatiguing over time. Okay, now let's take a look at the back. So first thing, I love the fact that it's so transparent, but one thing you might notice is that even though the fan is front and center, there's actually no ventilation for the fan around the fan itself. Instead, the air intake is below it, kind of near the bottom. So I guess the air is being sucked in near the bottom there, and then kind of being pushed up towards the top. And I feel like the fan is going to have to work pretty hard to get new air inside the device, considering the fact that the hole itself is so far away from the fan. However, I will say the device never really got that warm, and so this is probably just an observation and not really a big deal at all. Now, one thing I like to test is the fan noise. We're going to start with it off, and then I'm going to cycle through all the different modes. Overall, I would say that the fan is definitely something that you can hear as you're using it in the highest mode, but it's not that distracting. So I think overall the fan noise is pretty low. Okay, looking at the bottom, we've got a micro SD card slot complete with a flap. And then we have our USB-C port and our headphone jack, and then we have our dual stereo speakers. And you guessed it, let's do an audio test next. So right off the bat, I can say that the audio here is much louder than I was expecting, and I think it's relatively clear as well. I think the fact that we have such large grips really enhances the sound quality, and so I think these are relatively good for the price. Next, I want to move into a size and weight comparison. We're going to start with the Retroid Pocket 4 and 4 Pro. And the reason why I want to start with these is because they're around in the same price point and the performance is somewhat similar as well. However, as you can see here, there is a large difference in size. The RG556 is quite large. The screen on the Anbernic is also much larger. It's 5.5 inches, and honestly, I think that's a perfect size for some of these larger handhelds. Anything between like 5 and 6 inches is always great for me. Meanwhile, one of my main complaints about the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro was that the screen felt relatively small, and so if you are looking for something a little bit bigger, this really might take the cake. Another similar screen is going to be the one on the Aya Neo Pocket Air. This is their only Android device, at least as of right now, and as you can see, it's about the same size, about 5.5 inches, and also AMOLED and 1080p. And of note, between the two, I would say the Anbernic RG556 is a lot more comfortable to actually use. Other devices that are of similar size include the original AYN Odin. This one had a 6-inch LCD 1080p display, and same thing with the AYN Odin 2. Same size display and everything, but this device was a little bit larger. In fact, as you can see here, these two are about the same size. Now, if you're really trying to wrap your head around this overall size, let me give you a couple other size comparisons against other handhelds in the space. We'll start with the PS Vita. This is the 2000 series, but as you can see, it is quite a bit smaller. And then also here's the Nintendo Switch Lite. The screen is about the same between the two, but as you can see, see the Switch Lite is smaller. And then finally, just for one final reference, like I always like to do, here is the Steam Deck OLED. Next, we'll talk about weight. So this is 345 grams. That's about average, I would say, for a device this size. It will be heavier than some, for example, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, as well as the Nintendo Switch Lite. But it's actually lighter than some other devices of a similar size, like the Odin Pro or the Neo Pocket Air, and even the Odin 2. And so I think it is kind of in that Goldilocks range where it's not too heavy and not too light. Now, in terms of pocketability, this is not a device I would consider to be pocketable at all. Part of that has to do with the fact that it's just overall pretty large, but then also those big grips really make it awkward in the pocket. So if anything, this is a device you probably are going to want to carry around, maybe throw in a bag, maybe put it in one of those Gucci hardshell cases and you're good to go. But all the same, I would consider this to be a deliberate device. By that, I mean it's one of those that you can play on the couch and around the house, but if you're going to take it around town, it's not something you can just throw in a pocket. It's something that's going to be a deliberate decision. You'll have to throw it in a case or in a bag and then take it with you. Okay, that's about it for hardware. Let's move into the software side and do a little bit of light testing. To start, this is running Android 13, so it's not going to have the ability to boot into Linux or anything like that. And it takes about 21 seconds altogether to power on. Now, first thing I noticed are these really bright LED lights. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the Android build that we have here, which is very similar to other Anbernic devices running Android. To start, it's going to be preloaded with a bunch of apps, and all the emulators are relatively old. So personally, I replaced all of them, but one word of note, the PSP emulator cannot be updated to the most recent version. So among all of them, that's the one that I would keep and then replace all the others. And the device does come with Google Play Store, so you can go through here and then update your apps through that, or you could sideload them yourself. I'll leave a guide to my Retroid Pocket 4 Pro video, which will help you through that process. One other app worth mentioning is their FOTA update app. This is the one that you're going to use to update the system software. Right now, there aren't any updates for it, but I'm sure there will be some in the future. Now, one thing to note, there's an LED light at the top, but it's not going to power on unless you actually plug it in for charging. My battery's already at 100%, so it's going to show green, but it would show red if it was actually charging. Next, let's talk about the quick menu. We can get to this by swiping down from the top. And there's a couple functions here. The first is going to be on the bottom left, there's a game mode. And that'll open up Anbernic's own front-end launcher. It's the same thing as pressing the Anbernic button on the bottom left. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this launcher. I think it's always better to set up Android yourself. But if you want to learn more about their built-in front end, I did a whole deep dive about it in my RG405V review. So I'll leave that link down below in case you want to learn more about it, but honestly, I think you're better off just setting up Android yourself. Another function worth noting is they have what they call high mode. This is supposed to turn on the performance mode. I didn't see a real big difference in performance, but I did use this when using the high-end systems. Also, to the right of that, you have our fan control, and you have all the different toggles that you can choose from. If we swipe over to the right, there is a couple other options worth noting. For example, the ambient light option. This is going to toggle on and off those LED lights. Unfortunately, there is no option to, for example, change the color or the brightness, so it's really just a binary option. To the right of that, we have our control mode. By default, it's going to be in Nintendo Switch mode, which means the A button is going to be on the right. However, you can also swap it over to the Xbox mode, so the A button's on the bottom, and that's going to be handy for certain Android games and apps. Next, I want to talk about the screen. So this screen is actually really impressive. Number one, it gets super dim, but then also super bright. So I was surprised to find that there's a large range of brightness between the most dim and most bright setting on this screen. In fact, it might be one of the best screens in terms of this dynamic range that I've seen from an Anbernic device. In general, I've been using it at about 50% brightness to give me the best experience, but I have found that at 100% brightness, it's still super bright, good enough to play outdoors. For example, here I am in the shade, and I would say this is perfectly playable, but even if I go into direct sunlight where the sun is actually shining on the screen, I can still see what's going on. And this is not the case for most handhelds out in the market, and so the fact that we can even see this under direct sunlight or even in the shade is pretty impressive. Another thing I wanted to check with this screen is whether or not it has over-sharpening on the text. This is a problem with a lot of other Anbernic devices running Android, but it seems like they did not do this on this screen. Looking with my macro lens at a 10x zoom, you can see that the text is super sharp and clear. So I think overall, when it comes to the screen brightness as well as just the fidelity of that 1080p resolution, it looks really good to me. However, there is one discrepancy that I noted, and that is actually between the two devices that I have here to review. I did see there was a disparity in color temperature. If you look here, the one at the top has a little bit more of a green hue compared to the one at the bottom. And these are running with the exact same settings and brightness and all that, and so I'm not really sure why there's a difference between the two. And it's a lot more apparent when you're looking at text. If we swipe down from the top, You can see the difference in colors right here. The one at the top is a little bit more green and the one at the bottom is more red. And I'm not really sure what's going on here, if this is something with the quality assurance between the two panels or if it's maybe something between these two models. I have no idea. It might just be that these screens are not very consistent overall. Another difference between the two is the LED light experience. On the transparent model, these LEDs are kind of searing to the point where I don't really like having them on. Meanwhile, on the black model, they are nice and subdued to the point where I kept them on all the time. So I think this is something worth considering if you're going to pick one of these up and you're trying to decide between the colors. Personally, I like the transparent model. I love the fact that it's see-through, and I also think that it's just a little bit less smudgy than the black model. However, when it comes to the LEDs, by far I prefer the black one, to the point where I wouldn't even turn them on with the transparent model. And so if I had to decide between the two, I'm a little bit torn. The black one is great in certain ways, including those LEDs, but the transparent model has that really cool transparent look to it. So I'm not really here to pass judgment one way or another between these two colors, only to highlight the fact that it's not a very easy choice. And I'll probably make up my mind by the time I do the review, but right now I'm leaning towards the black model. I'm definitely not a fan of the smudging. I wish that they had maybe a white or a gray model instead, but I also like the subtle quality of those LEDs. And so yeah, I'm definitely torn about this. Now, like I mentioned before, last night I actually sat down for about 4 or 5 hours and I set everything up on the black model. And so this is the model we're going to be doing our testing with, just because I've already have this one set up and it's going to streamline that process. So now let's jump into the emulation testing. I didn't test every single system just because I know there are certain ones that a lot of people are asking about, so I tried to focus on those. So I really don't have a lot to say about the retro systems other than the fact that playing these on an OLED display is really great. One system in particular that I found to be a standout is Game Boy Advance. This one has a little bit wider of a screen, so the black bars are not going to be as prominent. And after I threw on a light LCD shader, I thought that this was a really nice experience. Another system that I just really enjoyed testing was PlayStation Portable. And there's a few things going on here. Number one, most games run at a full 4x resolution or 1080p. And I think these games look gorgeous. In fact, this is a really excellent way to play this system. Not only does it give you that OLED experience like the original PS Vita, but it's at double that resolution as well. And so this might be one of my favorite ways to play PlayStation Portable games. Now, I did find that not every single game played at a 4x resolution. For example, God of War Chains of Olympus only played at a 3x. Now, to be fair, that's still a 720p resolution, and I still think it looks really good, especially on this OLED display. But if you are looking for like perfect 4x or 1080p resolution PSP, unfortunately, this really can't cut it. But overall, this is a very minor inconvenience. Another high-end system I wanted to test was Sega Saturn. And one thing I was surprised to find is that the standalone Yabasanshiro 2 Pro app had really great compatibility with this chipset. And so just about every single game that I threw at it played at a full speed and with very little frame skip, but then also played with a 1080p upscale. And so I think just by default, this is going to be my standard emulator, just because it ran everything so well. Another Saturn emulator I tried is the Beetle Core within RetroArch. This is actually my favorite way to play Sega Saturn games because it's so accurate. And I did find that light to medium weight games like Panzer Dragoon or Nights into Dreams, these were playable. There were some dips here and there, but overall I wouldn't have any issues playing these games on this core. However, as I started to move up to the more heavyweight games like Sega Rally Championship or Last Bronx, these I found to be just unplayably slow, so you'd probably want to use the Yabasanshiro core within RetroArch or the standalone app instead. Okay, next I did quite a bit of Nintendo 3DS emulation as well. For this I'm using the latest nightly version of Citra with the Vulkan backend and a 2x resolution. Now I didn't test every single game under the sun, after all this is still a first impressions video, but I did test maybe 5 or 6 games and I found that all of these actually played at full speed. So I'm not here to say that every Nintendo 3DS game is going to play great, but the ones that I tried did play well. And I did test a couple that are more heavyweight like Super Mario 3D Land as well as Super Smash Bros. And overall I had a great time. All I had to do was do that initial configuration, set it to a 2x resolution, and then I was able to play these games with no issue. So if you are looking for an OLED panel to play Nintendo 3DS, so far this one looks pretty good. Okay, next up we have Nintendo GameCube, and this one I used the latest development build of Dolphin, and for here I also used the Vulkan graphic backend, and then I started at a 2x resolution and would reduce it as needed. And here I found that quite a few games played with a 2x resolution with relatively little issue. And overall I tested 8 games, and among those 8, 6 of them played at a 2x resolution at a full or playable speed. And I kind of did a mixture of light and medium weight games just to kind of get a feel for how many games are actually going to play, and the performance here was enough to give me confidence that most Nintendo GameCube games are going to be playable. You're always going to run into those that have compatibility issues, but at least as far as this goes, 6 out of 8 is not bad. In fact, the other 2 that I tested weren't terrible. Let's start with F-Zero GX. This one I did drop down to a 1x resolution, and I found that just on the first track it actually played pretty well. It was a little bit slow to get started, but I would say maybe a quarter of the way through the first track it stayed at about 60 frames per second and was pretty consistent. But as I got to the later tracks I did find some slowdown. So if you're looking for a perfect F-Zero GX experience, unfortunately I don't think this is going to be it, but I was still surprised to see just how close it came with this chipset. And then finally I also tested a game that's almost impossible to play at full speed, and that's Rogue Squadron 2. This one again I'm playing at a 1x resolution, and yeah, I would consider this to be unplayable. The average frame rate is somewhere around maybe 50 frames per second. So GameCube is definitely not perfect on this, and I'm not really sure whether or not I would consider this to be a GameCube machine, but at least in my first impressions I think we are pretty close. I'll have a better idea in the final review, so let me know in the comments down below what specific GameCube games you'd like me to test. Okay, next we have PlayStation 2. Now this one was a bit more of a mixed bag. For this I'm actually using the Nether SX2 patch of Aether SX2 version 4248, and I'm running this with the Vulkan graphical backend. Now to start I used whole numbers with my upscaling, so I did a 2x resolution first, and then if that didn't work I would drop it down to 1. And this app will allow you to do a little bit more nuance than that, but this again is just first impressions. And there were quite a few games that did play at a 2x resolution like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, as well as Soul Calibur 3 and Tekken 5. But I would say more often than not, 2x was just a little bit too much for this chipset. Instead, I found that a good chunk of games played at just the native 1x resolution. And that includes more standard games like Ratchet & Clank and Shadow of the Colossus. These are what I would consider more towards the upper tier, but not quite there. But then even games that are hard to run, like Beyond Good and Evil and Metal Gear Solid 3, I found these to be perfectly playable. Now a 1x resolution is a little bit chunky on a big screen like this, but if anything it just makes it feel a little bit more retro. So if you're looking for upscaled PS2, this may not be the perfect chip for you. But if you don't mind the native resolution to really kind of relive those experiences from about 20 years ago, then yeah, I think this will be great. Now I did find that for some games, dropping it down to a native resolution wasn't enough. There were quite a few that were a little bit slow. For example, Burnout Revenge was very close, but it just couldn't get there at a 1x resolution. And then same thing with Dragon Quest VIII. This one played okay in the very beginning, like the first battle and in that first field, but once I got to the village or town, it was a little bit more slow. I'm still on the fence about this because I would consider this to be playable. Yeah, it's a little bit of slowdown, but I can forgive that. But if you're looking for a perfect experience without having to go in and tweak the settings, then unfortunately this isn't quite there just yet. It's the same thing with those top tier games like God of War 2. This again is at the Vulkan backend with a 1x resolution, and it just has a little bit too much slowdown. So at this point, this is where I would go in and start to tweak those settings to see if I can get a better gameplay experience. I do think that God of War 2 is probably going to be playable with a little bit of tinkering, but at least right out of the box it isn't quite there. Let me show you another example with Champions of Norath. This is one of the hardest games to play on the PS2, and you can see that just at a 1x resolution with no other hacks, it doesn't really work. However, if I go into the settings and turn on a moderate underclocking, it actually works pretty well. I can definitely feel a little bit of frame pacing issues with this underclock, but all the same, I would say this is a much more playable experience. So again, much like with GameCube, I'm not ready to say this is a PS2 machine, but I do think that the overwhelming majority of games are going to be playable with minimal tweaks. So we'll cover this more in the final review, and again, let me know what games you want me to test in the comments below. Okay, our last emulated system is going to be Nintendo Switch. For this, I'm using the nightly build of Yuzu, and I'm keeping everything in a handheld mode. That means it's all going to be displaying at a 720p resolution. Now, I don't have high hopes for Switch emulation on this chipset, mostly because the Yuzu emulator is tailored more towards Snapdragon machines, and this one doesn't have custom GPU drivers like on the Odin 2. So as a result, I found that very lightweight games, those that are really kind of small in file size, these ones played fine. But as I started to creep up to the more heavyweight 2D games, things like Cuphead or Guacamelee or even Sea of Stars, I unfortunately found these not to be fully playable. There's definitely quite a bit of stutter as you're playing through these games, and it's really going to be up to you whether or not you can tolerate that. But for me, if I'm looking for the perfect Switch kind of emulator experience, this is not quite there yet. And hopefully with further development of this app, things will improve, but at least right now, it's not great. And if we move into the more 3D based games, something like Hades or even Super Mario 3D World, these are completely unplayable. And I might be cynical, but I think that no amount of Yuzu Switch development is going to really get us there anyway. So there's definitely a limit on Nintendo Switch emulation, and I would say it's really going to be with those lightweight games. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to test was game streaming. We're going to keep this very simple. I'm just going to do Xbox Remote Play. There's a couple things I'm testing here. Number one, I want to make sure the connection is good, and yeah, I think it was okay. And then I also want to test for the controls. Now, bear in mind, this is a 5 GHz Wi-Fi chip, and so if you have a Wi-Fi 6 or 6E environment within your home, you're not going to be able to take advantage of those upgrades. However, I think for most use cases, this will be pretty good. And like I mentioned before, the control scheme here is actually really excellent for modern games. Destiny 2 is one of my favorite first-person shooter games of all time, and this device is so good that I wouldn't mind playing this game on this device. And I'm really picky about where I play Destiny 2, and so I think that's really high marks for me. Okay, this video is way longer than I was expecting. It's supposed to be a first impressions video, but I really pushed it kind of far. In fact, I would more call this a light review than anything. Either way, because I'm not considering this to be a full review, I'm not going to do a what I like and what I don't like about it. Instead, we're going to do green flags and red flags. So we'll start with the green flags. These are things that I really was surprised about or liked about this device. And number one is the comfort. I think overall, this is probably the biggest advantage this device has over other Anbernic devices. It's easily the most comfortable handheld they've made, and it might be one of the more comfortable handhelds that are available at this price point. I also think the controls are decent. We'll talk about that more in the red flag section, but overall, I was impressed in the fact that all of these seem to work pretty well. I also really like the AMOLED display on this device. You get all those nice colors with that OLED experience and those really dark blacks as well, but I was also surprised to find how great it looks when it's dim and bright. And I also think that performance is a green flag for me. Remember, this is a device that costs under $200, and I think the performance that we're getting here is pretty much on par with that price point. I love the fact that I can play most 3DS, GameCube, and PS2 games on this device with minimal tweaks. I also think the battery life on the RG556 is pretty good. Even when really pushing it with those harder to play systems, I still was getting about 4 hours, and so I think that that's going to be a good average battery life. And the last thing worth noting is I didn't find any sort of big deal breakers with the device altogether. And I have to admit, that's kind of uncommon for Anbernic. They usually will screw up something. It's usually going to be the ergonomics or the software, but overall I would say this was a pretty pleasant first impressions. Now that being said, it's not perfect, so let's talk about the few red flags that I have just right off the bat. Number one, I'm not a huge fan of the quality of their plastics. I'm not sure why this is because a lot of their others are really great, but I found that both devices were relatively smudgy, and I didn't like how they felt so slick. It makes them feel very cheap. I also have a question mark here about this screen quality, because between the two, the colors are inconsistent. Everything else about the screen is great, but honestly, if I got one that had a little bit more of a green tint, I wouldn't like it as much. And unfortunately, I'm not really sure why there's a disparity between the two. And then finally, the other thing worth noting are the analog sticks. I think when it comes to Nintendo Switch style sticks, they're fine, but I think we're at a point where we need to have bigger or larger or just more responsive sticks overall. And I think among all the great experiences I had in the first 2 days of testing this device, I think it's definitely the analog sticks that are holding them back the most. Now, it's not the end of the world. In fact, I'm overall just really positive about this device. I think that they got a lot of things right. And I think if you are considering this device, there's a lot of great things going for it. To be more specific, I think that if you're an Anbernic fan and the fact that you've owned other devices or you like their level of quality, then I think you'll be seriously impressed by this one because it is quite a big jump up from their other devices. And I do like the fact that they're charging under $200 for this device. You know, a couple years ago when they had a device this good, they would have charged like $300 for it. And so I do appreciate the fact that they are maintaining some sort of competition with other handhelds in the space. In the end, that means that we're all going to win because we have lots of great options out there. The Odin 2, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, and now the Anbernic RG556. Now, as to whether or not this is going to be the right device for you, that's going to have to wait for the final review. I need a little bit more time to test this device and really compare it against the others. years. But suffice to say, my first impressions of the RG556 are overwhelmingly good. And I think the best praise that I can give it is the fact that I am looking forward to this next week of testing. It's pretty rare that when I get an Anbernic device, I like it right out of the box. Often what'll happen is there's something with the software or the hardware that I won't like initially, and it'll usually require some sort of update or me just getting used to it over time. And considering the fact that I like this one so much out of the box, I think that's a good sign. Anyway, let me know what you think of this device and what you think of the video down in the comments below. And if there are any specific games you'd like me to test for my final review, please leave them down below as well. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.